guys, welcome back, and as promised, here's the full Super Star Wars trilogy in one video as was originally intended. But you know, when you do stuff like this in your free time, some things just don't work out. So I'd like to thank all of you guys for your patience in letting me get this one finished, and I at least hope that you got some enjoyment out of this month-long ordeal. But anyway, let's just get to this collection of pain. Oh, and if you stick around to the end, or just skip to it, we can talk about some videos that are coming up in the near future and how all of you can help me with that. For now though, I hope all of you enjoy watching my patience slowly deteriorate over the course of 3 weeks with all of these Star Wars games. Super Star Wars for the Super NES ended up being the way that I experienced Episode 4 for the first time. And you know what? I kind of preferred it that way. But first, let's go back in time a little bit, more so than we already are, because this right here is the very first Star Wars game that I ever played. And if you can't tell, this is The Empire Strikes Back on the Atari 2600. And the first time that I played this, I don't even think I knew what Star Wars was, since I was only like 5 years old. But I still had fun flying around these weird snowy landscapes and shooting down these strange walker things. I had no idea what they were, but just going by the front of the cartridge, I mean, it looked pretty cool. The game itself is super simple, since you basically just shoot the walkers until they explode while trying to aim for their weak spots when they pop up. It's easier said than done, since your ship's physics is slippery as all hell, but it's not bad. What it did do though was actually just get me interested in what Star Wars was, to the point where I'd make sure that I watched the movies whenever they were on TV, and after that I was hooked. So as simple as it was, I can at least say that this game right here made me a Star Wars fan. And speaking of those movies, growing up in the 80s, I could usually count on Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi being on TV fairly regularly. But for whatever reason, the first movie, Episode 4, seemed to be MIA for whatever reason. So I never actually saw that one, and really never felt like I needed to, since I already knew how the rest of the story went thanks to Empire and Jedi. At least until I started to see advertisements for this all-new Super Nintendo trilogy of games based on the movies. Starting, of course, with Episode 4. And after seeing those pictures with these awesome graphics, complete with these crazy looking vehicle stages, I figured, you know what, maybe I have been missing out on that first movie.
Star Wars.
It was so hyped up that this was actually one of the very rare games that my video store got 2 whole copies in to rent. So you can bet that I grabbed it up as soon as I saw one of them available. And after all the hype, I couldn't wait to see what LucasArts could do with a proper Star Wars game on the all-powerful Super Nintendo. So let's see if this one lived up to the hype and was also a good introduction to the Star Wars movie for people like me that had never seen it. And right from the start, this game knows how to tell a story, recreating tons of full scenes from the movie into cutscenes that play out between the stages. And for as basic as they are, they do such a good job of hitting the main story beats of the movie that it really feels like you're moving through the story as you play the game. Which, as we covered previously in our movie games that don't suck video, that didn't happen too often. Usually, games would, at best, loosely follow the movie, or at worst, just completely ignore it. Super Star Wars definitely adds its own flourishes here and there by adding locations and enemies that weren't in the movie, but it's close enough that it all seems like this is just stuff the characters did in between the scenes. And I think this is actually one of the best things about the game. It also doesn't hurt that, for the time, this is a fantastic looking Star Wars game. Everything about the film and more has been carried over into the game. It's not going for a super realistic look or anything like that, instead going for a more stylized look that suits the Super NES better than just trying to digitize everything. While some of it can look a bit basic and barely anything has more than like 2 frames of animation to it, I still don't think you can mistake this for anything but Star Wars. Especially when you're climbing all the way to the top of a sandcrawler, making your way through the Mos Eisley spaceport, and finally fighting your way out of the Death Star. There's a sort of timeless look to this game that the sequels would vastly improve on, but for the here and now, it's a damn good looking game, and we haven't even talked about the vehicle levels yet. But don't worry, we'll get to those in just a minute. And the attention to detail carries over into the audio side of things as well, since the sound and music are just fantastic. And really, this is true for all of the games in this trilogy. The developers seem to spend a good deal of effort making sure everything sounded pitch perfect. From the iconic Jawa scream to the sand people doing that horrible war cry thing that they love to do, it's all here and it sounds exactly like the movie. And I guess it should, since LucasArts had full access to Skywalker sound, the studio responsible for all that stuff that you hear in the actual movies. But if there's one complaint that I have with it, it's that I wish there could have just been a little bit more variety, especially after hearing dozens of Tusken Raiders just going ham through an entire level. But what's here is really good. Even John Williams' compositions have all been stuffed into a Super Nintendo cartridge, and it sounds surprisingly good. While the graphics, story, and sound absolutely do a great job of turning Star Wars into a video game, the gameplay itself is just a little bit mixed. At its core, Super Star Wars is an action platformer. You're essentially blasting and jumping your way through all of these stages without much else happening. The gunplay is pretty solid, with your blaster being able to shoot in any direction, though this is one of those weird games where you have to freeze in place whenever you want to shoot. You'd think that might slow the game down a little bit, but honestly, it works pretty well, and it's not too annoying. What is annoying though is just trying to make your way through some of these stages. Your character doesn't feel too bad running around when they're on solid ground, but as soon as you leave the ground, you better start hoping for the Force to take the wheel. Because both your normal jump and your high jump that you can do by holding up on the D-pad kind of feels floaty to the point where you're in the air for much longer than you think you should be. And it doesn't help that just about everything in this game will push your character around if it touches you, like literally everything. Flying enemies push you across the screen. Weapons shove you off platforms, and even debris from enemies you've already killed shove you around like a 4th grade bully. So combine all of that with an iffy jump, and you're going to be missing a lot of platforms in this game. Which wouldn't be too bad, except that a lot of these levels loves to put in long platforming sections. Especially the now infamous Sandcrawler stage, where you have to jump all the way to the top of this thing while Jawas, turrets, and flamethrowers all want to push you back down to the bottom every single time you jump. It can be maddening, especially since this is one of those games where enemies will just respawn endlessly. And maybe if these levels were a little shorter, it wouldn't be too bad to deal with. But unfortunately, they just seem to go on for like 2 or 3 times longer than they need to. Repeating things over and over to the point of just kind of getting annoyed with it. Like how after you get your lightsaber for the first time, you fight this bantha. And I mean, this is pretty cool. It's a bantha and it explodes. But I guess a developer was like, yeah, that bantha was really cool, but wouldn't it be even cooler if they had to fight that bantha 3 more times in a row? And that's exactly how a lot of these stages in this game feels. There is at least a good amount of variety in those stages, but whatever variety they have quickly wears thin when they repeat the same sections and obstacles 15 times over before you even get to beat the level. The game does let you run around those levels with 3 characters that you get to choose from once you hit Mos Eisley. Of course, you start the game with Luke, who has his basic blaster that can be upgraded as you collect blaster power-ups, with each upgrade being surprisingly different. But as soon as you collect the next upgrade, you just kind of toss it. I kind of wish you could have just been able to choose which upgrade you wanted to use, but oh well. A few levels in though, Luke does get his lightsaber, which is, as expected, a ton of fun, especially when you do his contra flip with his saber just mowing through everything around him. Han and Chewie are a little less exciting though, only having upgraded blasters when you pick them, with no real advantages to using them over Luke. Except for maybe Han having this super sweet no-look shot whenever he shoots into the air. Still though, it is cool that you get the option to choose which character you want to play as at all in this game. The bosses sitting at the end of each stage are all impressively large, but unfortunately these are literally just battles of attrition. And this is another thing that kind of just carries through all 3 of these games. There's hardly any strategy here besides taking a few shots, dodging, and then just hoping for the best. The real highlight to a lot of these bosses, though, is how the developers reached into the lore and backstory for some of them. Like, I remember everyone flipping out that the Cantina boss is a real version of one of those holographic game pieces that you saw in the Millennium Falcon. And yeah, while that is neat, actually fighting him is more just like a wet fart than anything else. Thankfully, the vehicle stages really shine though. While the speeder stages are cool, where you get to fly around Tatooine and blast Jawas on your way to Mos Eisley, it was the attack on the Death Star and the trench run that really stole the show here. Flying around the Death Star and blowing up towers and TIE fighters was exactly what I wanted to do in a Star Wars game as a kid. It kind of looks like a mess these days, and you can only sort of fly forward, but it's still fun. And the trench run that came right after that level was, oh man, it was something. Putting you right into the cockpit of Luke's X-Wing as you make your way down the narrow trench, fighting Vader as the final boss, even though he just kind of sits in front of you, and then firing your torpedoes into the exhaust port right as Obi-Wan tells you to use the Force. These two stages alone really made you feel like you jumped right into the movie. So kudos to the developers for getting them picture perfect for the most part, at least as good as you could on the Super Nintendo. Overall, Super Star Wars ended up being a really important game for me on the Super Nintendo. This was the one that really got me obsessed with how well movies could be translated into a video game, since if done well, could effectively make you feel like you're playing an interactive movie. Yes, even a side-scroller like this. And as mentioned earlier, I had never even seen or knew the plot of Episode 4 until I played this game. In fact, when I was finally able to watch the movie one night and my dad rented it, I was kind of disappointed. The game had done such a good job of letting you play the movie's plot and honestly making it a lot more exciting for a 12-year-old kid than what the movie was. Of course, as I grew up, I had more of an appreciation for the original film, but I can't deny that at the time, I liked Super Star Wars, the game, more than the actual movie. And thanks to this game, even though I had already seen Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, I couldn't wait to see what kind of games those two movies could be turned into as well. And thankfully, I didn't have to wait too long for an answer. Super Empire Strikes Back for the Super Nintendo tries to be everything a sequel should be, but ends up being a frustrating step back in a lot of ways. As a kid, Empire was always my favorite movie, and it still is to this day. I loved the battle on Hoth, with the rebels desperately fighting an unwinnable battle with the Empire. Luke training with Yoda only to see that he wasn't ready to be the Jedi Master that he wanted to be. And then finally facing off with Vader on Bespin, only to lose and come out of it barely alive in the end. Yes, it was a darker tone, but that was one of my favorite things about it. Plus, it was just a huge jump in quality in just about every single way from the original movie. So I was hoping that Super Empire Strikes Back would be just as big of a jump over Super Star Wars as the movie was.
Big, new, sprawling space adventure in the Star Wars saga.
And just going from the back of the box, it really looked like this one was going to be the sequel that us kids were wanting, especially after seeing those screenshots of a full-on battle for Hoth level and Luke and Vader having their showdown on Bespin. Just those two things alone got me to buy the game. So let's see if it was worth the wait and my hard-earned money. Super Empire Strikes Back continues Super Star Wars' impressive storytelling with a ton of really great cutscenes in this game as well. And they all look even better here with some great animation to really make you feel like you're watching scenes from the movie. Some of them even getting close to CD-ROM cutscenes that you'd see on PC at the time. Empire also really ups the game here with just about every scene in the movie accounted for, and even some that the movie barely got to show. The graphics also get a big upgrade in Super Empire Strikes Back, maybe too big of an upgrade. This is a fantastic looking game where you can tell the developers spent a lot of time getting just about every single detail as close as they could. Like, look how good Luke's Tauntaun looks. That's just a good looking Tauntaun. Along with just about everything else in the game too. Every character, stormtrooper, weird alien, and level has had a considerable glow up in Empire. And while it may not be the most colorful game out there, since a majority of it does take place in the snow and a swamp, it's still about as good as you can get on the Super Nintendo. Gameplay though is largely the same in Empire, so we're just going to go over the new stuff and the bad stuff. You finally get the ability to actually run and gun in this game, along with a proper double jump that really should have been in the first game. And it goes a long way in making those awful platforming sections from the first game a little less awful. The big new change that the game throws in are force powers that Luke gets after training with Yoda. After that, you'll find a variety of force power-ups that you can access whenever you press the select button, with some really neat stuff like being able to freeze enemies, deflect shots back at them, slow time to a crawl, and even use levitate to completely bypass large chunks of the stage if you want to. These are all legit the coolest things in the game, and they're a ton of fun to use and experiment with. Unfortunately though, you don't get them until halfway through the game, and by then you only get a couple of levels where you actually get to play as Luke on Bespin, since you're playing as Han and Chewie most of the time there. So as much fun as they are to use, it just kind of seems like you don't get much time at all to play with them. Oh, and speaking of playing as Han and Chewie this time, while you don't get to select who you want to play as anymore, both characters at least get some unique special moves that they can use this time around. Han has his grenades that he can toss at enemies and are especially handy with bosses, and Chewie gets his patented spin attack, which is really nice since it anchors him to the ground whenever he does it, making some of the most annoying enemies super easy to deal with. Unfortunately, neither are as cool as using Luke's force powers, but it's at least more than they could do in the first game. The vehicle levels also get a big upgrade in Empire as well, since you actually get full 360-degree movement in this one, unlike just being able to move forward in Super Star Wars. And that makes a big difference in the snowspeeder battle, since you now have to fly past AT-STs and AT-ATs and then circle back around to take them down. Even being able to launch your tow cable onto an AT-AT and then circle around them to trip them up just like the movie. This level alone was enough to sell a lot of kids on this game, since it really is that impressive. But of course you also get Han flying the Falcon through an asteroid belt to shake Empire troops, which really feels like LucasArts was flirting with an actual flight sim here, complete with radar to track enemies. And then finally fighting your way above and below the clouds in an X-Wing on your way to Bespin, which was definitely not in the movie, but I'm not complaining since these levels are just so much fun. Really, that's where the good news ends though, because unfortunately Empire really doubled down on some of Super Star Wars' worst ideas for the rest of the game. You remember how I mentioned that you were getting pushed around a lot in that first game? Well, get ready to barely feel like you're in control in this game a lot of the time. Stuff is just constantly knocking and sliding you all over the place in this game, especially since the game looks to have tripled the amount of enemies on screen this time. This results in controller throwing levels of madness, when you're just trying your best to make a jump and the game is slapping you down over and over again. This isn't just difficult, it's demoralizing. At worst, you feel more like you're a pinball in this game than a Jedi Master. And the thing that really hurts this game the most is that it seems like all those shiny new graphics push the Super Nintendo a little bit too hard here, since just about every single stage seems to be running in slow motion half the time. While there was some slowdown in the first game, it's really noticeable here. Combine that slowdown with your character constantly getting punted around the screen, and you've got a game that just doesn't feel great for a majority of the time that you're playing it. It's really saying something when you finally get to use Luke's slow motion power and it just kind of feels like things are moving as slow as they usually do. This is also probably a good time to mention the difficulty here, because Empire really ramps it up. The first game wasn't exactly easy, but you could make your way through without too much of an issue. Empire is on a whole different level though. Obviously, all the stuff that I just mentioned already makes the difficulty high enough, but the levels are just brutal with annoying platforming and plenty of bottomless pits and one-hit kills. And those levels are just as long and repetitive here as they were in Super Star Wars, but they feel even longer since the game has multiple levels that are essentially the exact same back to back. It really starts to wear on you, especially when you just got done fighting for your life to make it through one of these levels just to see the exact same level come up again. Thankfully, the game does have some really cool stages though, like climbing your way to the top of an AT-AT and then fighting the head. And later on having Chewie make his way through the Ugnaught factory on Bespin to save 3PO. But sadly, a lot of what's in between those levels feels more like padding this time around. Honestly, coming back to Super Empire Strikes Back is really mixed for me. As much as I loved this one as a kid, playing it these days, I gotta admit it was pretty rough. I still love how close the game tries to follow the movie, and the vehicle levels are still really good, but the rest of the game is just kind of frustrating to make it through. The Force powers are a fun addition to the game, really letting you decide how you want to approach the couple of levels that you can use them in, but the overall gameplay feels too slippery and slidey in this one, especially with the much higher difficulty. I still like this one a lot though, and I think it does just about everything a sequel should, but Super Empire Strikes Back maybe needed some work done under the hood before giving it a really nice coat of paint. Hopefully, the final game in the trilogy can use the Force to bring everything together into one really great game. Super Return of the Jedi for the Super Nintendo was a great looking into the trilogy, but just couldn't quite finish as strong as it could have due to never fixing a lot of the problems that the first two games had. Return of the Jedi was probably the Star Wars movie that was on the most back when I was a kid. It was the newest one, and by then, Star Wars had already been a mainstream hit, especially with kids. And Jedi's lighter tone with a focus squarely on getting kids into theaters was something that a lot of fans of the first two movies wasn't too happy about. And even though I was one of those kids that was supposed to love it, I just kind of thought the movie was okay. Definitely nowhere near as good as Empire, but it was still a good end to the story, and I could mostly ignore the Ewoks if I wanted to. So by the time Super Return of the Jedi came out, I kinda had the same mindset for the game as I did the movie. I wasn't really looking forward to it, but if you put it on the TV, I wasn't gonna complain. And when I did pick this one up eventually, the overall feeling that I got was that I was playing a game that just didn't have the same effort put into it as the first two. But before we get into all that, let's see how Super Return of the Jedi closes out the series. First off, the good stuff. Jedi, just like Empire, looks great. It's probably the best looking and most varied out of all the games. For as bad as Empire was with repeating the same stuff over and over, Jedi gets it right with some really great looking stages every single time they pop up. And honestly, Jedi lends itself to better locations than Empire did anyway, and the developers really went with that. Like this awesome level in Jabba's palace where you're fighting through his throne room and it's filled with all these crazy aliens in the foreground and the background. I was actually just getting distracted by looking at everything. And the Ewok village on Endor, while a pain to play through, looks incredible. All the little details of the village and everything sitting around, plus that gorgeous backdrop is easily one of the highlights of the game. So no doubt, this is the best looking game in the trilogy. But one area where they kinda regressed are the cutscenes. While Super Star Wars and Empire featured hand-drawn cinematics that really fit with the more stylized look of the games, Jedi instead just uses digitized images from the movie, and they just don't look as good in my opinion. Plus, they've really cut down on the animation, so a lot of these are literally just still images, and it kinda takes away from the whole artistic vibe that the first two games had going for. But overall, the game still does a great job of following the movie, with every scene pretty much covered. It just kind of feels like less effort was put into it though. Now, if you were hoping that things were going to improve dramatically in the gameplay department over Empire, well, get ready to be disappointed. Because instead of making control and level design a top priority this time, it seems like the developers decided what players really wanted was way more characters to play as. Since not only does Luke, Han, and Chewie all return as choosable characters, but you also get to play as Wicket on Endor, and no less than 3 different versions of Leia to play as. And she's probably the most interesting character out of all of them due to that. The first time you get to play as her, she's dressed up as a bounty hunter with a staff to smack all the wildlife around with, and this crazy spin jump that tears through just about anything that she touches. The second time you see her, she's in full slave Leia mode and now gets a whip to beat dudes up with, along with a spin move that she must have learned from Chewie, since it's literally the exact same thing that he does. The last time you get to play as Leia is on the bunker in Endor, and this time she's just a generic clone of Han, only without his grenades, or really anything else. So there's not really much of a reason to choose her unless you just want to make the stage harder than it already is. The second new character is Wicket, and he could have been fun to play as with his smaller size and being able to scale trees using his arrows, but the stages he's on are just awful, with a bunch of blind jumps and direction that just isn't very clear. Plus, you don't even get to fight an AT-ST as the boss like they did in the movie, so to me, Wicket's just kind of a wash overall. The rest of the gang is mostly the same as before, only this time Luke of course gets his force powers from the very beginning of the game. Sadly though, he must have forgotten a few as he's had several removed, including that really fun levitate force power. But I imagine the developers didn't like that players were finding it more fun to skip large portions of the stage with, so Luke is unfortunately stuck on the ground here. Han and Chewie are back completely unchanged though, with Han really getting the short end of the stick here since there's almost no reason to choose him in the game over Chewie, since Chewie has a spin move attack that constantly recharges and makes him invincible when he uses it. Overall though, I really just kind of stuck with Luke for most of the game since he can actually heal himself with his force powers, and then maybe using Chewie if I was having trouble with the boss since he can kind of mow through him. But I guess you can't say that Super Return of the Jedi doesn't give you options this time around though. Now, if there's been one common complaint through this entire series of games, it's that the level design and the difficulty has all been pretty bad for the most part, and Jedi sadly continues that trend. Most continue to be straightforward affairs with the same bad, overly large, constantly repeating layouts that the first two games were dragged down with as well. But Jedi actually introduces several levels that are much more open-ended design-wise this time. Especially Jabba's dungeon here, and this one's actually closer to a maze than anything else in the trilogy. And no, it's not a very well done maze, since it just kind of seems like you're going past the same thing over and over with no real landmarks to mark your way as you go. There's also several levels where you're going back and forth to make your way up the level, and they all do a very poor job of pointing you to which direction is the correct way to go and which one is a bottomless pit. Now, I'm not against large explorable levels in video games, but at least give me something to work with here, instead of going a way the developers didn't intend and ending up wandering around a big open space with no idea where to go. Oh, and you know what? I completely forgot to mention that there's a new speed power-up that you can pick up, which is something you definitely should not do since it literally launches you across the stage as soon as you touch it. And the way these stages are designed, you're guaranteed to end up in a bottomless pit every single time. Of course, we get vehicle levels here as well, and Jedi really leans into them this time. In fact, the very first stage of the game has you getting to Jabba's palace on a land speeder by jumping gaps and dodging rock columns. It's not bad, but this repetitive, very linear vehicle level is kind of the first sign that these stages may not be up to the same standard that the first two games had set. Especially by the time you get to the speeder bike stage, since this one just does not work very well. You're basically just sitting around until a stormtrooper decides to pass you and then shooting them down while dodging trees and trying not to slam into the sides of the screen. It does a terrible job of conveying the sense of speed and danger that the scene in the movie did, instead being a framey, awkward jumble of a level. Then there's this stage where you're positioned on what looks like the most Mode 7 looking Millennium Falcon ever while shooting down TIE fighters. I mean, it is functional, but it's just so simple. Why not bring back a reworked cockpit view that was in the last game? That just worked way better and was more immersive and fun than this generic shooting gallery is. The fight on top of the Death Star is probably the only vehicle level in the game that really feels like it's on the same level as Empire's vehicle levels, with full 360-degree dogfighting. But it always kind of bugged me that it looks like you're shooting Nerf balls at each other instead of the classic Star Wars lasers. But the escape from the Death Star is where it all falls apart for me, literally, since this is like one of the few things that I've ever played in a video game that gives me motion sickness. It's a neat effect of flying through the Death Star's exhaust tunnels, but after a few minutes I feel like I just want to blow chunks. And it doesn't help that this stage goes on for a long time. At least in the first part you can kind of take it slow, but the second half you have to floor it through this thing to make it through without blowing up. I just can't do it. Overall, the vehicle levels just kind of feel phoned in this time, without the same level of attention that the first two games had. There's definitely more of them, but I'd take less just to have a level as good as the Trench Run or the Battle on Hoth in this game. Oh, and real quick, before we finish this one up, I just want to mention the difficulty. Now, I do think that Return of the Jedi is easier than Empire, but that's not saying much. It's still incredibly difficult. Everything that made you throw your controller in those first two games is back here as well. It's maybe a little easier to deal with, but I mean, it's still a really hard game. Thankfully, you do get passwords to make it through, but there were still more than a few stages in this game where I just felt like I wasn't going to be able to make it through. Now I know it sounds like I'm being pretty negative on Jedi, but I think this is the game where a lot of this should have been fixed, or at least made more tolerable. There's stuff that's still here from the very first game that was heavily criticized, like being knocked around by enemies constantly, which is somehow still a thing in Return of the Jedi. The bosses are still more of a battle of attrition than anything else, though I will say that at least some of these have some attacks that you can dodge this time around. And of course, the level design that really doesn't make much sense at all. This is all stuff that I've been complaining about for all of these games, but I just can't give it a pass here. So with all that said, is this a good send-off for the trilogy? I mean, overall it's not horrible, but like I said, a lot of this really needed to be better by now. Plus, the game kind of came out at a weird time for me. I actually didn't play this one when it was released, and instead just kind of picked it up one day when nothing better was at the video store. For whatever reason, I just didn't feel like I needed to play this one right away, since after spending hours playing Super Star Wars and Empire, this really seemed like more of the same, for a movie that I wasn't even that big of a fan of in the first place. And when I finally did play through this one, I didn't feel like I'd made the wrong decision. There's a lot of people out there that consider Return of the Jedi to be the worst movie in the original trilogy. And personally, I'd say that about Super Return of the Jedi for this trilogy as well. And that is it. We are done with Star Wars, I promise. But before I get back to working on next week's video, I wanted to see if any of you had any recommendations for future video themes, or if there's just a series of games that you'd like to see covered. Obviously, I'm on a time limit with these videos, so in-depth looks at like RPGs and other time sinks is kinda hard to do. So maybe keep it focused on stuff that I can play a good chunk of in a day or so. And while you're doing that, please click that like button one more time for this video to let YouTube know that I didn't just completely waste my time making this big pile of Star Wars reviews. But I think that's gonna finally finish these off. I'll be back next week with the standard format of a bunch of games to talk about. But until then, thanks for watching this mega collection of Super NES Star Wars games.